My name is Jessica Pierce. I am a senior site manager at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And today I'm going to be joined by Dr. Gina Vincent, who is an expert on screening and assessment instruments, I think in both adult and juvenile programs, but especially in juvenile programs. And the reason why we wanted to do this webinar is a little bit like why we did the webinar in December on drug testing. I really wanted to make sure that you were all hearing from the experts about these topics. So, you know, when we do training and technical assistance, you can hear from me, or you might hear from my colleagues about why it's important to use validated screening and assessment instruments, how you can do that, how you can use that information both in admission criteria and then also as you're planning case plans. But sometimes I think it's really nice to hear from the people who really are, they're the experts in these topics. And so that's who we have with us in Dr. Vincent, and I will ask her to introduce herself to you a little more fully in just a moment. But first, I need to let you know that this is a federally funded project. The National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, along with the National Association of Drug Court Professionals, has the Training and Technical Assistance Grant to provide support to all of you from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. But today's conversation is really our opinions and does not represent any official federal position. All right, so before we move on in, I have some polls and want to get some information from you. But first, I'm going to ask Dr. Vincent to tell us a little bit about herself and why, Gina, do you spend a lot of time thinking about screening and assessment?
Sure. Thank you, Jessica. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. So I am Gina Vincent. I'm the president of the National Youth Screening and Assessment Partners, which is a technical assistance center that is entirely devoted to helping juvenile justice agencies select and implement screening and assessment instruments that are going to help them make decisions and to implement risk-need responsivity in particular. I'm also the co-director of the Law and Psychiatry program and an associate professor at UMass Chan Medical School. And my background is in forensic psychology, where we really specialize in risk assessment and risk assessment methods and validation of tools and all of that. And I got very interested in working with juvenile justice agencies around implementing risk assessments because it helps us make better decisions, and it really helps kids stay out of the system who do not belong in the system, or at least we have them getting lower interventions when they don't need something as intensive. So that's really my interest, and this is what I've devoted most of my career to doing.
So I really appreciate that you're able to join us today, because I think you know how these instruments work in a way that is probably encyclopedic, really, in your knowledge about why we do this. And I think that your work and the work of your colleagues really is behind a lot of the changes and reforms that we see in juvenile justice right now, where we're talking so much about diverting low-level offenders. And that's a big part of what I think all juvenile courts are doing right now, is really using this unbiased information to make decisions about how to place kids into programs, and really working toward getting kids connected in their communities and remaining in the community and remaining with their families, rather than being scared about where kids might end up. We have better information and can make those choices in a more informed way. So I'm super excited that you're here with us. And as we talked a little bit about before we started, we provide training and technical assistance to the OJJDP grantees, but also to juvenile drug courts across the country in webinars like this. And our format today is going to be just a conversation. So for everyone who's participating today, what I've done is compiled kind of all of the questions we get on the technical assistance side from all of you as we're talking about screening and assessment, and we're going to run through them with Dr. Vincent. But I bet there are going to be questions that come up for all of you as we go along, and so I'd like you to feel free to use either the chat or the Q&A to post any questions that you might have. And then hopefully we will have a little bit of an opportunity to get to some of those kind of live questions as well. I do want this to be interactive with all of you, so we are going to use slido.com. So you can open up another window and go to slido.com. You can scan the QR code right there on your screen with your phone. You can get the Slido app and help us participate today. So for Slido, you're going to go to slido.com and you're going to enter in my code, which is 680213. Or you're going to scan that QR code and you're going to enter 680213. And then you're going to answer this question. And so we really want to know kind of what instruments you're using for risk need assessment and screening. So I've listed kind of the most common ones there. I may have missed one or two. I see we have some Ohioans participating because I see the OES showing up. I see other, and I'll write in chat. So we'll be able to get a sense of what folks are using. And then that'll help, I think, Dr. Vincent talk a little bit more specifically maybe about some of the things that you're using as we go along. I'm going to look in the chat also to see what people are writing. Okay, so I see the JASE, really, JASAE. Gina, you know that one?
I am less familiar with that one because it's a bit newer, but yes, I know it. It's for substance use specifically.
Okay. Great. And let's see what else we've got coming into chat here. And the DAI, I've not heard of that.
That is probably their homegrown detention risk screening tool.
Probably the D is detention, maybe? Yeah. Or
detention
maybe
assessment instrument. Yeah.
There we go.
Detention assessment instrument. Detention alternative instrument. Yeah. So I'm guessing these are homegrown ones. I mean, because that's generally what people do with detention tools.
Right. So we do have a lot of folks using the YLS, again, Ohio and the OES, although I know other states have adopted the OES as well. Everyone, you're getting a little cameo appearance by my cat, Lancelot here. He does love to be on a webinar with me when I'm at home. So, I mean, I think that's the best part about working at home. We get to see everyone's pet. And then we do have a substance use disorder screening tool based on the ASAM criteria also in chat. That's great. Okay, so the next thing I want to find out is sort of this question I want to ask all of you, which is a short answer question. We're also using Slido for this, which is, why do we use screening and assessment instruments? Rather than having Dr. Vincent kind of spend time talking about that, I thought you all probably know this answer. And so I figured we'll just get this out of the way as setting the stage. But why do we use screening and assessment instruments? So once again, at slido.com, you're going to have an opportunity. You can type a short answer. I think you can actually type several paragraphs if you're so inclined. So here we go. We've got help guide decision making. Yeah, absolutely. Remember that slido.com 680213. I'll use the YASI to determine level of risk and then apply a matrix. So you're really kind of doing that scientific approach to identify the needs of youth and provide appropriate interventions, to universally comply with evidence-based practice. Some of these are like the dictionary definition, I think.
Yep.
Gina, are you seeing anything that's standing out to you in the answers that are coming in?
Improve equity in decision making and avoid bias in decisions. I love that. That's great.
Really reducing the subjectivity is, I think, an important part of why we do that. And it helps us, again, convert those low-level offenders.
Level of supervision and targeted interventions. Good.
Very, very good. All right, I'll move us on.
Just one quick thing. What I'm not seeing is, and that might be just because we're going more general here, but is to establish whether someone's eligible for a drug court.
That's true. I think people did answer this really broadly, like to say matching kids to the right programs, but not necessarily saying specifically, the JDTC. And so I think that's totally right. That is a big part of the model with the juvenile drug treatment courts. For folks that have been to NCJF CJ webinars, you might have heard me say this before. but the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court guidelines, which are based on research, have a lot of recommendations, but the one area where we have the most concrete information, the best research, is around this eligibility criteria, because that's a really common thing that researchers looked at, a common question that was asked. And so we really know those three factors that make good candidates for the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court, which is that they're moderate to high risk of reoffending, they have a substance use disorder, and that they're 14 to 17, right? Those three factors we know lead to youth being more likely to graduate from the program. So always keep that in mind as we're talking about things like risk assessment. All right, so now to finish setting our stage, I do have a couple of basic questions that I'm going to ask Gina to answer for us. And the first one is this question that comes up for us a lot, which is, what is the difference between screening and assessment, and why do people get this mixed up? I'll hear people use this interchangeably, and sometimes I'll even do it myself, but there really is a difference, right?
Yes, sir. And I hear people use them interchangeably all the time as well. And yes, there is a very important difference between these two. So a screening tool is, I call it a tool. It is really designed to help you do something quick and dirty without extensive training. So the staff who complete a screening tool don't have to be extensively trained or have specialized credentials. And it's designed to help you sort youth into categories or buckets. So essentially, this is a group of youth who don't have whatever this issue is in question, all right? Whether it be substance use concerns, mental health concerns, or risk for reoffending. This is a group of youth who don't have this, who we're pretty certain do not have this. And we can say that with a fairly high degree of accuracy. Versus here's a group of youth who might have this issue in question, and those are the youth that we need to follow up with an assessment instrument. So the screen is short. They're intended to be short. They're intended to not require specialized training typically. And in order to put together a good screening process, that means that it is conducted with every youth who comes in a certain entry point. So whether you're doing this for kids in a detention setting or youth at probation intake, they should all be getting it. That's a screening process, because the whole idea is to identify who needs something more and who doesn't need anything else, okay? An assessment instrument is really an instrument. It is much more comprehensive. It is intended to take this pool of youth that have been screened in to determine, do they really have whatever it is that we're trying to assess? Do they really have a major substance use concern? Do they really have a major mental health concern or diagnosis? And are they really at moderate to high risk for reoffending? And if so, what are those dynamic risk factors, otherwise known as needs, that we need to be concerned about? So the assessment requires specialized training in order to complete. Some of them are going to be done by a psychologist or clinician. A risk assessment, as you all, I'm sure know, those are often done by probation officers who have specialized training. And they're going to take more time, and they're generally going to require gathering some collateral information. That's not true of all assessments, but it is true of many of them. Now, when it comes to the risk screening and assessment issue, that kind of defies, some risk tools kind of defy those definitions. The definition I just gave you has been written about by Thomas Grisso in juvenile justice settings for a long time, in many different juvenile justice briefs and books and so on and so forth. And it applies very well when we're talking about substance use or mental health or even disability or even learning disabilities of some sort. But the whole risk assessment area has sort of defied our understanding of screening and assessment in some ways, and that is one of the reasons that people tend to get mixed up. Not to mention, another reason people get mixed up is because the tool developers are labeling things as assessments that I would not call an assessment. And so there's a whole lot of reasons to get mixed up about this. When I think of risk screening and assessment, a risk screen is something that's really designed just to tell you, is this person at low, moderate, or high risk for reoffending. And that's all it's going to tell you. It's still short, it's still generally done by somebody who doesn't have a lot of specialized training, so it's still intended to be done quickly, but it is answering a question: is this youth low, moderate, or high risk for reoffending? The assessment then should have dynamic risk factors. That's also going to tell you what are those kids' needs, and is also going to give you a more accurate picture of whether that youth is low, moderate, or high risk for reoffending. So it's a long-winded answer, but these get mixed up for good reason.
So people shouldn't feel bad if
No.
if they do get confused.
No. One other quick point: a screening tool is not intended to be used to make decisions about treatment or case planning. You really need an assessment instrument for that. We lost the
And what
slides
about
for a minute. There we go.
Yeah, I was bringing those back up. We had I think a little glitch. We also have, I think some courts feel like if they can assess every single youth, they should. Is there a reason not to? If you do have an instrument that has like the short screener and then a longer risk assessment, is there a reason to skip the screener and give everybody an assessment, or does it make more sense to kind of follow that protocol?
Here's how I typically respond to that: is that it's really based on your resources. So if we're talking about risk, assessments are always better than screens. They're always going to give you more information. They're always better. If you have the resources to do an assessment on every youth, I would generally recommend doing that. But it also depends on the point at which you're doing these things. So if you're doing something pre-adjudication, it's often much better to do a screening tool first and only assess kids who, screen in as moderate to high risk, and or move past a certain point. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Concerns about self-incrimination, concerns about time, resources, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to mental health or substance use concerns, I would say always do a screening instrument first. Always do a screening instrument first. You're not getting a lot out. I mean, it's sort of a waste of resources and money to be assessing every youth for those.
Right.
I hope that helps.
Right. So that brings me to this kind of second question, which in drug court, we do have kind of dual purposes, which is to really address a young person's substance use and then also that delinquency. And so there's a lot of assessment happening, I think, for these kids. And so can you talk a little bit about the difference between that risk screening and assessment and then the clinical? And again, why do people maybe get these mixed up?
Yes, that's a great question. So I still do see these getting mixed up too. So again, if you get them mixed up, you're in good company. There is no assessment instrument that is meant to assess every single issue. There's just no good, I'm trying to find a word better than issue or concern, but there's just no assessment instrument out there that has been validated that's going to tell you everything that you want to know. Assessment instruments are designed for specific purposes. So a risk screen or assessment is specifically designed to tell you, is this youth relatively low, moderate, or high risk for recidivism? And some of them look at specific types of recidivism, so violent or sexual recidivism, for example. And is this youth, and what seem to be the drivers of this youth's behavior? Now, researchers hate it when I use the word drivers because that implies a causal relationship, but it's just the easiest way to explain this is it's also going to tell you what is likely contributing to or maintaining this youth's delinquent behavior. All right, those things, as you all know, are very important for making decisions about case planning, but a risk screen and assessment those are designed specifically for those purposes, and any good risk assessment instrument is not going to have items on it that are not related specifically to recidivism. If the item has to do with a well-being need or something of that nature, it really doesn't belong in a risk assessment. Risk assessment instruments should only contain items that we know to be risk factors. So those are things that increase the likelihood somebody's going to reoffend. Okay. A clinical screen and assessment is something that often, a clinical screen is something that generally, anyone can be trained to do. Again, it doesn't require specialized training or specialized credentialing. A clinical assessment generally requires a clinician of some level. I mean, they vary at the level of training needed, but they're going to be specific to behavioral health kinds of concerns. So is there a significant substance use disorder? Is there a significant mental health diagnosis that we need to attend to or treat? So risk screens and assessments really are not designed to tell you this youth has a mental health diagnosis. They're not designed to tell you this youth definitely has a substance use disorder. Only a clinical screen and assessment are going to do that. Obviously, we know substance use is a risk factor for reoffending, so any good risk screen or assessment, not necessarily a risk screen, but any good risk assessment is going to have items related to substance use in it, but they're not diagnostic. I see a lot of YASI users, and you might be thinking, what is she saying? Our risk assessment has mental health in it. Yes, it does. That is an unusual feature of the YASI, and anyone who uses the YASI knows that those mental health items are in there specifically to try and identify who might need a mental health assessment. They're not designed to tell you to use risk level in any way, shape, or form. Did that answer your question?
That totally answered the question, and it made me think of another question, which is you said something that I think I didn't realize, which is that these instruments, especially risk instruments, aren't necessarily supposed to be gathering information about like protective factors or strengths. But I sometimes see, like if I'm looking at like a YLS or a PACT report, that you can kind of interpret some of the information you get to say, oh, this seems like it might be a protective factor or a strength. Should people not be using those that way, or should they be doing another kind of instrument to figure out those kinds of things?
I'm glad that you raised that, because I should have been clearer in my definition that we are seeing obviously more risk assessments coming out that have protective factors in them, and they should be labeled as such. They're protective factors. Those are still related to recidivism. They're just related to recidivism inversely. So I was saying that there shouldn't be any item in your risk assessment instrument that's not related to recidivism. That is absolutely correct. But we have risk factors, and some tools have protective factors. And those are there to measure, again, youth who have a lot of protective factors are less likely to reoffend. So they're still there to tell you something about the youth's risk level, but they're also, protective factors and strengths are also, in addition to telling us something about youth's risk level, they're also there because of this general sentiment that we should be emphasizing youth strengths. We should try to enhance youth strengths and protective factors, and we can leverage those if they have them. If they have any protective factors, we can leverage those in our case planning to help that youth succeed. So for example, if they're already very good at social competence and their social skills, we can leverage those in ways to help them do some leadership development, or put them into groups with other kids where they're going to, be able to develop a positive peer group. So there's ways of leveraging those, but protective factors are still, by definition, supposed to be related to recidivism. They're just related inversely. And to be honest, we don't have any good direction yet about how to use protective factors in case planning. I'm sure many of you recognize that. We don't have any good information yet about how we use these in case planning. And in fact, my group has a study, along with Jennifer Scheme and CSG, has a study right now where we're looking at that. So in a couple of years, we'll be able to give you more information.
Well, that's how this whole field is. We're watching it evolve as people are still out there doing the work with the kids. So, and I think it feels intuitively right to us, that idea that we could build on these things. And, it gets into the science around resiliency and all of that. But I think until we have some real data, it's hard to make those calls, especially for someone with a PhD like you.
It, yes, it is. It's hard to know really how to use those in case planning. It really is still kind of challenging to know. There's no recipe or formula like risk need responsivity. The first R and the N, it's very clear how you're supposed to use these in decision making and case planning. Some of these other pieces we're still trying to figure out.
And what I see a lot of probation officers do is use that as sort of at least giving them a direction to kind of go in their like talking with the youth to develop that case plan, to say, it seems like you might have some leadership skills and maybe we could figure out if there's something you would like to do around that, and letting the youth kind of bring more information. That's kind of what I see a lot of probation officers doing. But there definitely isn't like a formula where you can plug this in and get the right answer.
Exactly. Yeah.
So another issue that really comes up a lot for courts, and I'm sure you've heard this a ton, which is how do the courts know that the information provided is true? They feel, the kids lie and downplay and try to not be in trouble. So how can they feel good about those results?
Yes, great question. This is a great question. So as I mentioned, my background is in forensic psychology, and we know one of the first principles of any kind of forensic assessment, and for those of you who might not be as familiar with that terminology, forensic assessment just means you're assessing someone who got in trouble with the law. So we know as a rule, one of the first principles of forensic assessment is people don't tell us the truth, okay? So we need to assume people are not going to tell us the truth. And that's very different than if you're a mental health clinician and you're out there in a community mental health setting where the assumption is people are coming to you because they want help and they're going to tell you the truth, right? So we're in a very different system, and we're dealing with different issues. In some ways, the issues are the same, but in other ways, they're very different. So a risk assessment should never be done, and I'm sure many of you know this, it should never be done based on an interview with the youth alone, ever. And I have actually seen jurisdictions that forgot that over time, and they started completing their risk assessments based on only an interview with the youth, and that's it. And these were kids on probation or kids who ended up in a placement, and you look at their data and it indicates that that all of their youth are doing well in school. None of them do drugs, and none of them have ever been suspended. And so I looked at some of these jurisdictions' data, and I said, what are these kids doing on probation? So it is imperative that we do not base any assessments on self-reported information from youth alone. However, we absolutely need their information because the youth are the best reporters. By the time they hit adolescence, they're the best reporters of what they're actually doing. Okay, their parents don't know what they're actually doing all the time. Their teachers don't know what they're actually doing all the time. The youth are the best reporters. So we need a combination of interviews with kids, interviews with the youth in question, and as much collateral information as we can get. That is how we ensure that we're getting the most accurate information. And as any of you know, a risk assessment instrument is not something that you just have the youth fill out on their own. You're not just asking them questions that are yes/no questions. It requires judgment from the rater, the trained rater, to gather all the information they have and then make a decision. Is this item low, moderate, or high? Or is this item a 1 to 5, or however it's scored? So there's always rater judgment involved based on the credibility of the information they're getting. I will also just make one other point that, and again, this isn't rocket science, this is probably common sense in many ways, that if you're doing your assessments pre-adjudication, which many jurisdictions do because they have good protections against self-incrimination, and they have good protections against that information being used for any purpose prior to adjudication. If you're doing assessments pre-adjudication, you're going to be a little more likely to see some lying than if you do the assessment post-adjudication. Especially, if you are doing any pre-adjudication assessment, the kids and families should be very aware of what the protections of information are and the limits of confidentiality. They should be made very aware of that. But we even see with mental health screening tools like the MAISY, which has a whole scale devoted to drug and alcohol use, when it's done pre-adjudication, kids aren't telling the truth on that scale. We see kids pre-adjudication being much less likely to have any drug and alcohol use. Then we see kids post-adjudication, and we don't think that that's because the kids are really different. We think it's because they're not telling us the truth. So pre-adjudication, we're a little more susceptible to lying on our instruments. But as for any risk assessment, we always want collateral information, and I would say that's true for many substance use disorder types of assessments as well.
Hey, I can totally see why a young person pre-adjudication would lie, because they're hoping to get out of trouble. It seems totally rational to me.
Exactly. And they're worried if they confess to drug and alcohol use, then, I mean, it's not legal for kids to be using drugs and alcohol. And so there's some concern that they're just going to have another charge brought against them if you don't already know that they're using drugs and alcohol. So, I mean, that's a concern pre-adjudication too.
And obviously our defense attorneys who are listening are thinking, yeah, I would advise them to lie, because why would
Exactly.
So this brings me to my next question, which I think these two are really related, which is that we will often talk to courts and they'll tell us that they've done the screening and assessment and they have kids that are kind of on the bubble for fitting into the juvenile drug treatment court criteria. And they're like, you know, they're not quite moderate. They're like the very top of low risk, or, you know, they don't quite have a substance use disorder, but they're definitely using it, but they know the family, or they've, you know, seen like the things happening in the peer group that this young person is involved in. And what should they do about those kids? Should they just go ahead and say, we're going to make an exception? Should they wait and see how it plays out? Is there a way to get more information? What do you think could be a good approach to this problem?
So this is a great question. Well, all the questions are great, but this is a really important question because it's kind of complicated. And the easy answer is it depends, because it really depends on what is it that's not screening them into drug court. What is it that you're seeing that's indicating that they're not the right fit for drug court based on your assessment instruments? That's the first issue. So there's and if they're low risk, which as this implies, if low risk is the thing that's making them not a good fit for drug court, I would argue not to bring them into drug court at all. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, drug court is an intensive intervention. There's very compelling evidence that when we put low-risk youth in those kinds of settings, first of all, we're not getting any bang for our buck, okay? We're not seeing improvement. At the very minimum, we're not seeing improvement in recidivism, because these are kids who were unlikely to recidivate at baseline, okay? So there's not a lot of improvement to be had there, right? So we're not seeing much improvement. The other big concern, especially with drug court, is if this is a youth who's, you know, low risk for reoffending, they're starting to use marijuana, we bring them into drug court with kids who are doing maybe more serious drug use. They're maybe using harsher drugs, they're higher risk. We got to be very concerned about peer contagion. The peer contagion research really started with kids in drug treatment. All right, so it is a huge concern to me. It's always been a huge concern to me about mixing marijuana users with kids who are doing harder drugs. Like, I don't know what's the most dominant drug in many of your drug courts, but if they're doing opiates or they're doing cocaine, I am going to be very concerned about you putting a kid who's starting to experiment in with those kids who are now teaching them how to get these other drugs and teaching them what's the great thing about these other drugs. I'd be very concerned about that. So those are two reasons not to put low-risk kids in drug court. And there's also a reason not to put kids who are experimenting with substances into drug court. What can you do if you're worried that this youth is starting to go down a slippery slope, or you think your assessment instruments are inaccurate? If you think your assessment instrument is inaccurate, I agree with what you're saying, Jessica, that what you want to do is probably wait until you've had some more time with the youth, reassess them at some point, and maybe you will find out they're actually moderate to high risk. That's very possible. If you're concerned about the validity of your assessment initially, I'd give it 90 days and maybe do it again. All right. There's also, I've seen this more in the adult drug court literature, and to be honest, I haven't seen as much juvenile drug court literature on it, but I haven't looked in a couple of years either. So some of you may be more aware than I am, that there's kind of this lower level intervention drug court, like a different path that's used for low risk offenders in the adult settings. And they're not mixing them with moderate to high risk. It's not as much intervention, but they are still getting something, some level of substance use treatment. So that may be another option. I know, Jessica, do you have any? Go ahead.
Well, I always think that we should build out this continuum of care, right? So that you do actually have something that would make sense for kids that are even sort of on the cusp of low, moderate risk, or who are in that experimentation phase, don't quite have yet something that would be considered a substance use disorder, but they're approaching it, right? And so we really encourage courts to build those things out. And some of our juvenile drug treatment courts do have sort of what we think of as drug court light kind of programs where they would put somebody who's a low risk offender. I think though that the real challenge is, and I think it's really specific to juveniles, is that we want to have as light a touch as we can, right? We don't want to keep kids in the system. We know that the longer their system involvement is, the kind of worse trajectory they get on. And so what happens is if we're keeping kids in that sort of low risk track, what are teams doing to have guardrails to make sure that they're not criminalizing typical adolescent behavior, that they're not escalating that young person into the kind of traditional drug court? There shouldn't be a lot of crossover. If you really truly have somebody who's kind of that low to moderate risk, then they need a 3-month program and off they go, right? And so if courts can create those sort of protections to keep kids in that program and not escalate them further into the system, I think it's a good idea. But I think it's really, really challenging to do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a big struggle.
I think it's really challenging. And I think it is too. And drug court is not, juvenile drug courts are not my specialty. So I haven't looked into this in a while, but back in the day when they were looking at those low-level interventions for kids who were starting to experiment, the data were indicating it was making them worse, not better. And so I think you want to be very careful about whatever those low-level interventions are. I'm just thinking of the DARE programs and the educational programs, and right. So I think you just want to be very careful about what those are, and I'm sure that there's a lot of good guidance around how to do that now. It's just not something that I'm not familiar with.
Yeah, I know that like the Reclaiming Futures Project is doing a lot of great stuff around brief interventions right now, which seems like a nice fit here for that sort of not quite ready for drug court and hopefully won't be youth. But I do think, I mean, the other thing is people want to make sure that kids get help. And so that I think most people do this with the best of intentions, but it can have unintended consequences.
Yes, absolutely. It's always for good intentions, right? Yes, and that's great. That's great to hear about the Reclaiming Futures and what they're doing.
Yeah, so folks, go to Reclaiming Futures website and check it out if you're interested in those brief interventions. All right. So you talked a little bit about kind of the main drivers of youth crime, and I use the term driver here, even though you say your colleagues don't like it. So what are those main things that probably are going to come up in the assessment to tell us kind of why kids are committing crime? Yeah,
this is one of my favorite questions because we ask. My group trains on multiple risk assessments because I am not a risk assessment tool developer, and we help agencies pick whatever assessment instrument they want to use, and sometimes we do the training on that instrument, and sometimes we send them to the vendor to do training. Depends on the instrument. So, and I raise this because one of the first things that we ask people at any training, and often these are probation officers, but we've trained various types of staff, clinicians and so on. The first thing we ask is, what do you think when you're presented with a youth? What are the features of that youth that stand out to you that tell you this is someone I need to be really concerned about? We always ask them those questions because it's very interesting to hear what people say. And it's also very interesting to see, usually there's a lot of variability around what different types of personnel or individuals are attending to when they're looking at a youth and trying to make a decision. Is this youth high risk? Is this youth somebody who's likely to reoffend? Is this youth somebody that I need to be concerned about? Until people have been trained on the same instrument, they tend to have these very, very different views. And one of the very common things stated is family and what's going on in the home when we ask them those
100%.
questions. Very often, that's one of the big ones. I'm sort of sad to say that the research is not bearing that out necessarily. So that used to be my top pick as well when it comes to youth, is that particular risk factors within that family circumstances domain that you all see on your risk assessment instruments would be the biggest drivers for reoffending for adolescents. That's what I used to always think. It's actually not. Clearly it's a risk factor area, but it's not one of the biggest ones. So let me just say very quickly, the main drivers of youth crime, probably you guys are all aware of this because you all have a risk assessment instrument. The main drivers and the domains based on what Andrews and Bonta and Hogue and all of those men told us, and it hasn't changed much, is family circumstances, parenting. So it's certain types of factors going on in the home. It's education. So it's generally around poor educational achievement and bad behavior in school. Substance use. Okay, substance use is a driver depending on how severe it is and how much it's interfering with their life. Another primary area is attitudes towards offending and crime. Do they condone offending and do they condone violence or not, essentially? And another big one is personality behavior types of factors. So this is your impulsivity, callous, unemotional, depending on the tool that you're using. Some have that in personality, some have it in attitudes. It really depends. I wish it would be nice if we were all on the same page about these things, but we're not. And anger control issues and that sort of thing. Okay, so when you figure those are your primary domains, and we all know those are the areas strongly related to youth crime. Those are the primary drivers of youth crime. We all know this, okay? It's been documented over and over again, multiple longitudinal studies, multiple different samples over time. However, even among those primary drivers, there's variability in the strength of the association between those and reoffending. And the most important ones, and I will say this in all of my training, the most important ones are the ones that probation officers and other types of juvenile justice personnel are typically not trained to identify or to attend to. And those are the criminal behaviors and attitudes. Okay, so it's not the family, it's not the education, it's not the substance use, although all of those are important. We know those are all important. The primary ones are the intangible attitudes about offending and crime, and behaviors and personality behavior. So that's impulsivity, poor anger control, callous, unemotional, lack of remorse, attention deficit. So all of those go into that personality behavior bucket. And the third most important one, actually it's second or third, depending on the study that you see, is one I didn't even remember to mention before, and that's peer relationships. So we know what that is.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up if you didn't.
Yeah, sorry.
I think peers are a thing.
I don't know why I didn't mention that before. The peer associations, so we know with adolescents, I mean, you guys are all obviously aware that the peers are the most influential source in their life. And for adolescents, the peer area is incredibly strong. It's an incredibly strong predictor of recidivism. When we're dealing with children, it's not as strong a predictor. When we're dealing with adults, it's not quite as strong a predictor, but when we're dealing with adolescents, that's a biggie. So the top ones, criminal attitudes, criminal behaviors, personality, that's a big one. Second one is peers, and the third is attitudes, and the peers and attitudes have been interchangeable depending on the study. So those are the really big ones. The way that your assessment tool categorizes those and labels those is going to vary depending on your risk needs assessment, obviously, on your instrument. So that was a long-winded answer, but this is a really important thing because I really want to have people, we really try to get people to attend more to that personality behavior area and making sure if that youth has those risk factors that you are putting a service in place that is going to attend to it, because it often gets neglected.
So it makes me think one thing, and then it makes me want to ask a question, which is that detention as a sanction seems like exactly the worst thing to do for any one of those risk factors, because it's, if you have a negative attitude, that just sort of reinforces it. It's going to introduce you to an entirely new, terrible peer group, and it's not going to do anything to address any of those kind of internal deficits that might be occurring. So I think that when we're thinking about detention, we always talk about it in the juvenile drug treatment court and in juvenile justice altogether as being kind of the sanction of last resort. But to me, it feels very much like you don't get anything to help push that needle down on their risk assessment or their risk level by using detention. But my second thing is a question, which is I've seen a lot of things come out in the last 5 or 10 years from companies like we have the Carry Guides, we have the BITS, we have things like Thinking for Change. Are those the kinds of things that our probation folks should be seeking out to help them with these challenges, or is there something else?
Yes, love those. The Carry Guides, I think, are getting a lot of good traction. Now, I haven't seen the outcome research for those yet, to be frank. I'm sure there's some that exist, but what I have seen is that the probation departments that have adopted those approaches and have really spent the time training their probation officers how to do it, they're saving money because they're not outsourcing services as much. They're doing most of it in-house, and they're having low recidivism rates. So I highly recommend those Carry Guides. They're really targeting those issues that I just mentioned, but as is Thinking for a Change, as is MST and FFT, they deal with family, but they also target a lot of the issues I mentioned. Anger management, if you've got a good one, any kind of cognitive behavioral based treatment, really, that's manualized is going to target those.
Okay.
And detention is a whole other issue that we might want to get into later if we have time.
That's just my own personal soapbox that I had to hop up on for just one moment. Now I'm off. But I do really encourage everybody, if you don't have these other tools that really are being created in response to this idea that we do know what's driving our youth crime. And so if you can think about how you can incorporate some of those strategies, whether it's happening at the treatment provider, whether it's your probation department, I think it's really a key to being successful. And then, of course, coordinating between those different services. So if probation is doing something, it should be complementary to what's happening in the substance use treatment, and all working together kind of toward those same goals of reducing that risk. So if you're not familiar, I think, again, check out some of those tools and instruments. All right. We are right coming up to the end of our time here. But I did want to ask this question about reassessment, because I think it's something that teens struggle with, is understanding how to interpret what happens in a reassessment. So if they are doing a reassessment at like 6 months in the program, sometimes maybe the overall risk doesn't change. Is there something that the court should be doing? And is there a different way to think about the information that they're getting?
Yeah, so there could be one of two issues going on if you're not seeing change in a reassessment in 6 months. Actually, there could be one of three issues going on. The first is that could be the reality that there's just not been change yet. because that can happen. You may have a youth that's just going to take a little longer than that. So that's number one. Number two, the first thing that I would do is revisit my case plan and see, are we actually addressing these dynamic risk factors, otherwise known as needs? Are we actually addressing these in the case plan? Like, where did we fall short of that matching? That would be the first question for me, is what are they not getting that we need them to get? Okay, that would be the first one. The third issue that could be going on here is that you might have a risk assessment that is too heavy on the static risk items, and it's just not going to do a good job of measuring change. Some of the risk needs assessments still highly rely on static risk items for some reason I don't really understand. I mean, they're important for predicting recidivism, but on a reassessment, it doesn't really make a ton of sense to have your static risk items heavily weighted there. They're still gonna matter, but the whole point is sort of trying to see change, right? And we know that kids can change. So take a look at your static risk items to dynamic risk items ratio on your risk assessment instrument. If there's a lot of static risk items, then probably what you would want to do here is not look at the scores that are being generated from your tool, but instead look at whether you've seen change in those specific dynamic risk items that you're reassessing. Does that make sense, Jessica?
I think it totally does. And I think sometimes with something that is like the risk assessment, it feels very much like it, that you can't just sort of dig into it and use it, and instead, like, you have to look at it as like the whole package. And so the idea that you could like just really focus on and say, well, we've been working very hard on this negative peer association, and I really want to think more about whether or not, you know, these pro-social activities we've introduced are helping, then you can get in there and just look at that one piece to say, oh yes, I see that there is definitely a change here, right? That would be something
Right.
that would be kind of allowable, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Absolutely. Yeah. Justifiable, allowable. We'll let you do it.
Nobody's, the assessment police aren't coming to arrest you for that.
Exactly. Exactly.
All right. So I wanted to turn now to some questions that we've gotten coming into the chat and the question pod. And so the first question I have is, do you recommend co-defendants that are both at moderate risk be placed in the same drug court program? And I bet this happens all the time.
You know, that is a really tough question. I'm probably not the best person to answer that. I mean, based on the research that I'm aware of, I would say it depends. I mean, if they're both moderate risk, I would want to suss out the dynamic in that relationship. Is one of them the leader and one of them the follower? If so, I would probably want to separate them. If that's not the case, I think you might be okay keeping them in the same program, but I just think it's really going to depend on what's the dynamic between those two.
Yeah, and so I think if folks want to chime in chat, if you guys have had strategies that you use for this, because I think this is kind of one of those times too where it becomes like an all or nothing. If you can't really kind of keep them separated, they are going to the same treatment groups, they're coming to court, then maybe you don't take either of them because of that idea that it could exacerbate the relationship. Right. So yeah, I'll let folks who think about this from that legal side, and also any of our clinicians chime in there. Let's see, do I have any other questions? Oh, I think we're getting a chat answer. Okay, so here's another question. For the OSI, the overall risk score may not necessarily change. But the dynamic risk score should, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So so there's a situation where you've got actually completely separate scoring for your dynamic risk and your static risk, which makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'm going to ask you to give us kind of a final thought here. before
Well,
we move
I
on.
see one question. I see one question in the chat. How about programs that help with legal socialization to help youth with favorable attitudes or being law-abiding? Do you see that one?
Yes, I think that was my colleague Martha kind of thrown out a good idea.
Oh, sorry. Maybe there's a question mark there, so I was thinking it as a question, but it may not be. So I think that there's a carry guide around this about kind of law-abiding behavior and shifting attitudes. I can't remember for certain, but I feel like there was. There are programs trying to increase youth civic responsibility, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't say that I know the outcome research on those, but those are certainly types of programs that have been attempted. If they're manualized, I feel better about them.
Right, and you think about kind of the whole concept of community service and what that really is supposed to be about is that reparation, and then also linking kids and helping them feel like they're part of their community. I don't think that happens very often in court just because doing meaningful community service is really hard. And everybody has a lot going on. And so you default to things that feel more like a punishment. But if we think about community service as a way to help bolster that civic attitude, I think you could see different outcomes. But I think you're right, we don't have research on it yet. I do see another question here in our question pod, which is a big thorny question that I think you'll have to answer in kind of a surface way, but people should really be thinking about, which is, have you addressed trauma and intergenerational trauma and the neuroscience information associated with the impact of trauma?
How do we address it? So the question is, how do we address it? And I think I am definitely not the expert on how do we address it. That would be Dr. Keith Cruz, who's done a lot of this kind of work with kids and research around how to address trauma. The piece that I do feel comfortable discussing is that, a lot of the youth, obviously a lot of youth who get in the system have been exposed to traumatic events. The question is not, have they been exposed to traumatic events, because we're going to screen just about all of them in. The question is, are they having trauma-related symptoms that are related to and maintaining their delinquent behavior or their violent behavior? That is the question, is, are they having trauma-related symptoms? We actually know that a lot of youth are resilient. A lot of youth are resilient. They've all been exposed to trauma. Most of them have been exposed to traumatic events. Many of them are not having trauma-related symptoms as an outcome. The question is, are they having trauma-related symptoms to the level where this has something to do with their delinquency, or it's going to be really challenging to put together any kind of case plan for them until we can address it? That's question number one. And then the second question is, what's the best course of action for this youth given their trauma-related symptoms? And that is going to vary. That's going to vary, but it's probably going to be some combination of mental health treatment and emotion regulation.
Yeah, and I think I think we have to address the trauma, but I don't think addressing the trauma is necessarily going to cure the delinquency, right? And so it's not driving delinquency, but it definitely is something that it could get in the way. So yes, it can actually be one of two things. It could be a barrier, so that it's really hard to address any of those dynamic risk factors until you address some of the trauma first, or it's actually underlying some of their dynamic risk factors and maintaining them, in which case you do need to address it, because it's almost like a causal connection there, right? Regardless what that means for you all, is if you're seeing that, you're addressing both the trauma and the criminogenic needs. And I'm sorry I used the word criminogenic needs. The dynamic risk factors or the needs. You want to address both, okay? And trauma is a responsivity factor, yes.
Thank you, Rick.
Trauma as a responsivity factor. Thank you, Mr. Steele.
It is a responsivity factor, which means it's either a barrier or it's something that's maintaining the risk.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, so we're right at our time. I'm going to ask Malika to put in chat our evaluation for this. And I'm going to, Gina, I'm going to give you 1 minute to do your final thought and answer this last question that I see in chat, which is, do you have an instrument that you recommend or a couple of them that you recommend, and your final thought?
I saw that question. It's such a hot button issue because no matter what I say, I'm going to get in trouble. It's such a hot button issue. Yes, I do have my favorites, and my favorites are those that have the most research behind them. And that is the YLS and the Savory. I saw none of you are using the Savory, but the good thing about the Savory is that it's got built-in flexibility so that you're able to use it with youth from different cultures in a way that it's hard to do with some of the other instruments. Some of them, and the other thing I like about those two is they both have research indicating that they don't have racial bias. So those are my two picks, top picks. The Aussie and the OYAs, you know, are right there, right behind them. Any of those four are good instruments to use. I'm sure I'm going to get in trouble from someone from that response. But there you have it.
And I do think, though, that going back to the idea that we really want as big of an evidence base as we can have for our instruments, yes, and relying on that to help us make our decisions. I want to thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it. I hope everybody else got something out of it. I thank you all for being here. We're going to have another Tune In Tuesday in April, so I hope we'll see you there. Thanks, everybody.